I love it. And just for clarification for viewers and myself who might not know, so you said you're with the 173rd Airborne Brigade out of Italy. So is that a paratrooper infantry division? Well, could you break that
Yeah,
down a little bit?
so yes, sir. So yeah, it's paratroopers, all paratroopers, just like the 82nd Airborne Division, and there's another one out of Alaska now. But um, anybody that's watched Band of Brothers should be familiar with what paratroopers are and what we do. And so yeah, it's just another level above, kind of. I wouldn't say as far as like elite, but we do train differently. We train harder. We train, for a lot of different missions and objectives, and so it's definitely a different mindset, different unit, and different tier.
How long did it take from the time you arrived in Afghanistan, if you remember, to the first time you were, outside the wire, in combat, or anything of that nature?
Um, so when we first got to Afghanistan, that first deployment, like I said, we were up in the mountains, so we were at a pretty serious elevation. I can't really remember off the top of my head, but it was 9, 10, 11,000 feet, something like that, on the side of the mountains that are part of the Hindu Kush that goes into where you've got K2, Everest, and a lot of the world's tallest peaks. So we were in the foothills of that, and it took some acclimating. We got dropped off on a helicopter, met up with the unit that we were replacing, and our first time kind of going out the wire was up this little hill, going to where our range was to zero in our rifles and make sure everything was solid. And I remember going up this little 50, 100-yard hill, and I was so smoked and just so out of breath by the time we got to this little hill, that I just couldn't even imagine how we were going to walk around this place for the next 15 months, let alone up and down hills all day. But that being said, I mean, the body's a pretty powerful thing. We adapted and we got used to that elevation, and we were able to do pretty well going up and down. It became kind of a game.
And now you've really piqued my interest. So is it pretty? It must be freezing.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So in the winters, for sure, coming from Southern California and the beaches and everything, that was the first time I'd ever experienced single digit weather outside of having my snowboard, being in the mountains up in Mammoth or Tahoe, and it was a whole different animal. It was something new to get used to, and being out overnight in the cold like that, being up in the mornings, walking around, and just living in that kind of cold was a whole new experience.
So in '07, what is your unit's objective? Like what goals? Where's the Taliban at in relation to you? Are you just holding the territory? Are you running a lot of patrols? What's the overall objective for your crew specifically?
So at that time, where we were on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, we were there to basically eliminate freedom of movement within our whole company's battle space. That means, whether it's setting and placing in ambushes, constant patrols to eliminate that freedom of movement because we're always out and they have no way to gain a foothold in the area. It was, reaching out to the local population, winning hearts and minds that way, helping with local reforms, school reforms, building schools and building projects, and basically trying to stabilize that region, as well as preventing that enemy freedom of movement so it doesn't come in and there becomes a vacuum again. So there was a lot. It was pretty high op tempo. We were in, day out, and it was a pretty heavy area. So anybody that's familiar with the 173rd at that time, there's a few books that have come out about it with for Korengal and some of the other battles that were fought there. And so it was a rough time. It was definitely a paradigm shift in the war up there as well, with the surge and all that. So it was pretty kinetic area, pretty crazy area. Like I said, mountains everywhere, and the terrain, the people, and everything just made it somewhat of a rough time.
So, and that's kind of what I want to get into a little bit here. Before you went, in your mind, again, you're only 19 years old, 19-year-old young man, full of adrenaline, obviously. Did you ever question whether or not you'd be able to pull the trigger when the time came, or did you know if I have to pull the trigger, it's not going to be an issue whatsoever?
I think I knew. Well, I think when it comes to that time, it's not necessarily something I ever really thought of. It just was one of those things that if it happens, it happens, and I'll hopefully react accordingly. because before that I hadn't been tested in war, in battle, in a gunfight or anything like that. So it was just kind of one of those things that you keep in the back of your mind and hope that you react right, in a sense, because you see all the movies, you see other people, you hear stories of other people that maybe, freeze up, get gun shy or anything like that. And you just hope that maybe that's not you. And if it is, that you can kind of ride out that hump and get it in order. But I will say one good thing about the military is that when it comes to training, we train hard, hard, hard. And whether that's tired, sick, injured, broke down, we really train to the point where it truly is muscle memory. So going into some of these contacts, some of these ticks and everything, it is almost like an out of body experience. And you kind of come back to afterwards like, whoa, what just happened? I blacked out, so it was, but you're there, but it's, almost on autopilot to a degree.
Do you remember like the first time you found yourself in a situation where bullets were flying and like, this is not the real deal? Like, this isn't training. Those are those guys want to kill us. We were shooting at them. Do you remember the first time the stakes were that high?
Yeah. So one of the actual times that I remember is the first time we were taking pretty direct fire, and I wasn't ready for it. Was we were actually on this little OP on this ridge line that overlooked the valley around us, as well as where our comp was down in the center and down in the bottom of this little valley. So we were there kind of as a first stage of defense for anybody that would come over the ridge line, try to shoot down at us, take over our cop or anything along that route. And so cop is just essentially combat outpost. So the way that it was set up, we were up there, and me and one of the other guys were actually working out with basically just a fence picket and some 50 cal ammo cans on it, just killing time, because we do rotations up there for a week or two at a time, and then come back down to the rest of civilization. So while we were up playing Lord of the Flies and lifting weights, we had come into contact, and I didn't know what it was at first. I thought somebody was messing around with some firecrackers or something. That's the first thing that popped into my mind, and I don't know why. Because prior to that, we had gotten into some kinetic fights and everything, but all I could think of was firecrackers. I looked around and was like, "Hey, man, who's screwing around right now?" And my other buddy grabbed me and pulled me down behind one of the little short-walled Hescos that we had, and that's when I realized that we were taking pretty heavy enemy fire. I couldn't hear anything, as far as return fire going back. And, I kind of realized that the fire we were taking was so effective and so heavy that even our guys that were on guard weren't able to get their squad automatic weapons up and return fire. And it had kind of caught not so much everybody off guard, but it was just pretty heavy and pretty effective for the amount of people that we had up there. And so I was a 240 gunner at the time, and I had eventually gotten to my 240, got the gun up, all the other guys got their guns up, and we suppressed the enemy at the time, had, close air support come in and do their part and kind of clean everything up as well. But that was like one of the times that I will say from that deployment where it was a little spotty. I was just in some shorts, no shirt on, and hiding behind this little 2 foot by 2 foot cube, it seemed like, until there was just enough of a lull in fire where I could get up, and because they were coming right over our heads, and until there's enough of a lull in fire where I could get up and go get to my gun and all that. So.
And was that one of those moments where you kind of blacked out and then came to and you're like, oh man, like what was that?
Yes and no. I mean, as far as like the entirety of the events go, the fog of war is a weird thing. It is a real thing, and I think it's just a matter of adrenaline and everything else going on that, it's such a state of disarray to some regard. And, but I do remember looking at my 240 and saying, I need to get to that. And once there was just enough of a lull in fire, I remember getting to it, pulling it down off the roof, and then just laying fire back with everybody else. And it seemed to help out. So that's one of the ones that I do kind of remember more closely. But the rest of them, it was a lot of pop shots here, a lot of pop shots there, us returning fire, them returning fire. But it was pretty fairly kinetic for that first deployment.
When you call an air support in a situation like that, do you guys have like Air Force JTACs or something embedded with you, or is that on you guys on your own to get on the radio and call in helicopters or whatever it might be?
So we don't always have JTACs or CCTs that embedded with us, or TACPs or any of those guys. There's sometimes on bigger ops where, it's a bigger force that we may have some of them detached with us, but usually it's just our forward observers. Our 13 Foxes is their MOS, but there are forward observers. They usually call in all the artillery support, whether it's artillery, mortars. A lot of times they'll be on station to call for the birds as well, but usually that goes back and forth between a couple other people as well. But yeah, we generally have people on the ground with us that can maintain and talk to those guys in the air.